So, I think we can go ahead and get started here. First off, I'll say to all people in attendance, thank you all so much for coming to this roundtable. Really excited to put this together and to get this lovely panel of discussants as well. So just to give a quick introduction, my name is Robert Tanner Bivens. I go by Tanner, and I will be chairing this discussion on the status of LGBTQ plus rights in the post-Orban era. Now, the way this is going to work is I'm going to go around the room, allow my other participants here to introduce themselves. Afterwards, I'm going to just give a brief introduction of kind of the reason why we're here today. And then I'm going to give everybody about 5 to 10 minutes to kind of give their own thoughts on the conversation at hand. And then afterwards, we're going to open things up to questions and comments. I have a couple of questions as well, but we'll be taking questions from the audience as well as questions from other panelists, and we'll go from there. So, with that said, like I said, my name's Dr. Robert Tanner Bivens. I'm from Illinois College. Have expertise in LGBTQ plus rights, international organizations, and in particular, authoritarians and their relationship to LGBTQ plus rights. I'll go ahead and pass this around the room so everybody can kind of get their introductions in. So I'm going to start with the person to the left of my screen, which is Catherine Butterworth. So Catherine, please, by all means, the
Thank you,
floor is
Tanner.
yours. Mhm.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, and thanks for convening the round table and the thought-provoking prompt. My work focuses on sovereignty in cases of contested sovereignty more broadly, but it also extends to the European Union and its activities in human rights promotion. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion here today.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to move along with my screen here, even though I know it's very different for other people. But Anna, I do believe that you are next up. So please introduce yourself and let us know who you are.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm so happy. I'm thrilled to take part in this absolutely wonderful and politically relevant discussion. So, as you said, my name is Anna. I will just say my last name, which is Grzywacz. Probably, difficult to pronounce. So I work as an assistant professor. I'm based in Warsaw in political science and international relations, of course. I'm based in Warsaw. So I work, my research interest include human rights, all things human rights and norms, specifically in non-democratic context. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So next up, I have Martin. So Martin, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Tanner, and hello, everyone. My name is Marton Guerra, and I'm a PhD candidate of organization theory at the Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University in the Netherlands. Yeah, broadly speaking, my research focuses on how social movements and civil society organizations navigate the rise of illiberalism, and in a second strand, I study what it means for managers and firms. Most of my empirical research relates to Hungary, and I think it was 3 years ago when I published a piece on the Orban's government and Viktor Orban's anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric. And thank you so much for organizing this roundtable. It's very important and so exciting. So I'm looking forward to it.
Fantastic. So I have Michael. Michael, you are next.
Great. Thanks so much, Tanner, and hello, everyone. I'm excited to be part of this conversation today. My name is Mike Swigert, and I'm a scholar practitioner. So I lead program design, research, and evaluation for democracy and human rights initiatives, while I'm also leading my own scholarly research agenda as an affiliate faculty at George Mason University. My research generally focuses, it's best described sort of as political psychology. I'm generally interested in the role that social identities and group norms play in processes of social and political change. And sort of within that umbrella, a lot of my research has focused on global LGBTQ plus rights movements and norm change in particular. I'm particularly interested in contexts where we have these narratives portraying the LGBTQ plus rights movement as a foreign threat to national identities, values, and norms, and what the implications are for norm change on queer rights within those sort of contexts. And a lot of my research is primarily on that topic, is primarily focused on the context of Serbia. So I'm happy to share kind of that perspective today within the broader context of Eastern Europe. So thanks, everyone, and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Hadley, please.
Okay, hi. Thanks, Tanner. And like everyone, I'm really pleased to be here and be a part of this event. And I'm very pleased that this kind of event is happening because, despite the kind of immediate critical juncture of Orban's losing the recent election, I think that this is a problem which is as I'm sure we'll discuss, likely to continue on the larger scale. And so we need to keep talking about it. I'm a associate professor in gender studies at the Central European University in Vienna, Austria. Now, we used to be in Budapest, Hungary, until we were thrown out by Viktor Orban. So we're happy to see him go for a variety of reasons. I teach in a gender studies department, but my degree is in anthropology. And so it's interesting to me to see how many different perspectives we've got working together here. I think that's going to be fun. And my research has been primarily on Hungary's sexual political situation. Its LGBTQ plus / queer, whatever you want to call it, movement, the history of that movement, and really the broader phenomenon of what's sometimes called post-socialist homophobia. So this always involves intersections with nationalism, more recently, but also historically, intersections with past right-wing politics and present right-wing politics. So I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. So once again, thank you all for taking part in this. And I think this is a conversation that definitely needs to happen. One of the major reasons why I brought all this together is because there's a lot of questions in the world on what this actually means, what this can mean for the future for LGBTQ plus populations, not just in Eastern Europe, but abroad, but also what this means in the immediate effect as well. Because even though you see Orban step out of power, there's still a lot of questions about the current regime in Hungary and even what they plan to do. So I'm going to go ahead and give just a quick introduction here of kind of like the reasons why we're all here. And then I'm going to pass this off to everyone to kind of give their thoughts on the situation. And then afterwards, we'll open up for a kind of question and answer and question and discussion. So, as we're all very much aware, on April 12th, Peter Magyar and the TISA party defeated Viktor Orban and Fidesz in what is considered to be a landslide victory. And this brought to an end Orban's 16-year reign controlling Hungary. Orban is often cited as a kind of spiritual leader for these right-wing populist movements that we have seen come to prominence in recent years, and with many of those leaders also adopting Orban's strategies in order to not only win elections but control democracies in what Orban self-describes brand of an illiberal democracy. And with this also comes, as we all know, for the past 16 years, a lot of attacks on LGBTQ plus communities. And this includes constitutional amendments that ban LGBTQ plus events. This include media and education censorship. There were levels of surveillance. And so there is a lot going on here. And Orban, in his defeat, very much speaks to some trends that we're also seeing, because we've seen also the right-wing populist movements in Poland start to recede a little bit. But we've also seen some actions in Slovenia, even though the current administration has stepped back into power in recent days. But we also still see countries such as Georgia that have had a very hard turns toward very pro-Russian sentiment. And so with Orban, who was this kind of spiritual leader of these right-wing populist movements stepping out, and this new administration stepping in, there's a lot of questions at play. What this means for the region, what it means for right-wing populist movements, what it means for LGBTQ plus communities, and so on and so forth. And so this is the reason why I really felt it necessary to bring this roundtable together, because I think having someone like Orban step out of power really leads a lot of questions on what comes next after this. Is this going to be the start of something new, or is this just kind of sometimes what we even see just kind of a quick blip before somebody like Orban or somebody like Orban just takes control and continues moving forward, especially when it comes to LGBTQ plus communities who are suffering the brunt of these administrations. So with that said, this is the main reason why I brought this together. I feel like there's a lot to discuss when it comes to LGBTQ plus communities, how they can respond to these right-wing populist movements, and also what this means whenever you see someone like Orban step out and somebody like Magyar step in. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to my participants to give their thoughts on the matter and their discussions, and then we will carry on from there. So I will start off here. Um, Hadley, Hadley Rankin, if you would not mind starting us off. And just so that the attendants also know, we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes for discussions here, and I'll just be keeping track in case we go a little bit too far over. But the floor is
Okay.
yours.
Thanks, Tanner. So it's very hard to know how to address the, some of the fundamentals or contextual issues in a short period of time. I'll just throw out a few thoughts. I think one key thing to keep in mind for the Hungarian context is, and perhaps the broader context, is that it's very easy to see somebody like Orban as I don't know, the maintainer, the continuation of a history of a continuous history of oppression, and to see his kind of national homophobic politics as sort of the maintenance of a past history of homophobia. I don't think most people know enough about the history of Hungarian socialism or the post-socialist turn to necessarily grasp that it's a much more complex history than is often imagined. The key thing here, I think, is that in the 90s, following 1989, Hungary was in many ways, I think, a very an optimistic place for queer people and queer politics. And it's important to remember that there were 10 years of basically completely peaceful and fairly successful, not large, but mostly uninterrupted pride marches before the Pride March was finally attacked in 2008. And maybe we can say more generally the late 2000s. And so I think it's important to remember that Orban came in as a figure who was changing that trajectory. And that if we know that, perhaps we can see that there's ups and downs rather than sort of trajectories of open liberalism and opening liberatory time, and know that the history of queer politics as anywhere is something that in a way rights come and go. They can be present, relatively speaking, and they can be taken away. And we can have moments like Orban's departure, which seem really hopeful, but those moments can turn around just as either earlier hopeful moments turned around. So this is something. I think something else to mention quickly is the importance of things like time and space. So as an anthropologist, I think the material, what matters in sexual politics and questions of who's considered a member of society, who is considered normal or not normal, who has a certain relationship to certain norms, as Michael was saying, depends on quite a lot of subtle things. And some of these things have to do with presence in public space, right? The sexual character of public space, or the gendered character of public space. They have to do with the sexualized and gendered character of time. And something that I think is very important in what, say, Viktor Orban tried to do in creating this vision of a heterosexual reproductive nation posed against the West. Some of what he tried to do involved the encouragement and the proliferation and intensification of national myth-making, which was very sort of heterosexualized and heterogendered. And this went along with and justified many of the policies. And I think this is really critical to think about, like how these may these myths, national myths of a heterosexual Hungarian, heteronormative Hungarian past may continue to underwrite certain relationships, even though Orban and his immediate policies are gone. And then the last thing I'll say, because I'm sure I'm running out of time, is just that the meaning of sexual identities in politics of all kind, normative and non-normative, in Eastern Europe, as in most of the world at this point, is really very much shaped by transnational relations, sort of neo-colonialisms, post-colonialisms, and the way in which, for example, Orban could make these arguments about the importance of protecting traditional, which wasn't at all traditional, Hungarian identity against the imperial threat of the West. And the ways in which people like queer people, as well as immigrants and others, become instruments to be manipulated as a part of this struggle is very important. And again, I don't think these relationships on the larger scale are going away just because Orban is gone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And also, I will say, you were almost exactly on the dot. 9 seconds over. So excellent working way to keep on time. And thank you for those very insightful comments as well to really get us going here. And I think hitting on some of the major themes that's really kind of permeate throughout this discussion. But to move on, so to give the others some time, Catherine, you will be next. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you, Hadley. I think you bring up some really important points. And I think what I have to say kind of intersects with that. So in organizing my thoughts for today's session, I was really thinking about the systemic factors, right, at the national, regional, and international levels, right, that either lead to the suppression of LGBTQ plus rights or their elevation, right? So that's one thing I want to talk about in my opening time here. And then the other is how we define characteristics of the current political climate. So when we say that, what do we mean by it? And thinking about that, I don't think I'm going to say anything really novel right now, but I think one of the main themes of the current political climate is that there's a lack of trust, right, in the legitimacy of institutions, both political and economic, and longstanding institutions. And these can be at the international level, but they can also be at the national level. And I think, this also includes the questioning of the purpose, right, or the legitimacy of the European Union. And we saw that with Orban's government, right, that claims that, the EU infringed on Hungary's sovereignty, infringed on Hungary's national culture, right, understood in a very particular way, right, in Orban's lens, right. And so I think that's important to keep in mind in the broader scheme of rights that we're talking about. We're also talking about the international and the systemic moment we're in right now that questions legitimacy of institutions, and that this transcends national and goes to the international level. And I think the implications that this has, right, at the national level is we can ask, at what pace will the new government make reforms? How long will it take to uproot Orban-era government officials and political institutions? But also something that is national and regional, right, to the East European, Central European space, is that there's not, broadly speaking, a normalization of LGBTQ plus rights, or having these rights be understood as human rights. And so in order for such rights to be institutionalized, there has to be political will, right? And there also has to be time, right? It's going to take time to institutionalize these. Now, the European Union comes in at the international, I think, and supranational level, certainly, in trying to institutionalize these rights, but it can only do so in a very at the supranational level, right? It can't really cross over into the national sovereignty, which again is kind of what we saw with Orban's Hungary. Like that's where sovereignty and EU law clashed, right? So it really depends in that sense on the leadership, but it also goes much more broad, I think, than just a particular leader or a particular party, because again, these issues are systemic. So until we have rights that are institutionalized, right, there's going to be a heightened vulnerability to regressions, regardless of what party is in power. Because sometimes it's about political party, right, and political leadership, but it goes much more than that and goes into society as well. So I think in order to handle future challenges, whether they're internal or external, there has to be the political will and the time to institutionalize LGBTQ plus rights. The last thing I'll say on this too is there's the clash, right, between EU law and norms being implemented uniformly throughout member states. We know that that doesn't happen, right? But also EU law does not include same-sex marriage as a universal right. So it only goes so far. It promotes human rights and LGBTQ plus rights as human rights, but only to a certain extent. So it stops short, right? And in doing so, I think there's an inherent tension. And it's really illustrative, actually, I think, of the moment that we're in right now, where it's we'll recognize rights to a certain point, but no further. And with that, I'm curious to hear what other people have to say as we go through the conversation. But thank you.
Fantastic, Catherine, most certainly. And also, just really also want to highlight those conversations of time, trust, and institutionalization, which I think is some of the key elements here of what's at least on the table for discussion and just kind of those question marks that still kind of linger in the air. So fantastic. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to Martin. So, Martin, you are up. Martin Guerra, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanner, and thank you so much for the excellent introductory statement, Catherine and Hadley. I'm afraid that I would be less organized compared to you, but I just want to go back to what you said, Tanner, in the beginning, that because I think the question that whether this is actually, speaking of Hungary, is this a new chapter, or whether Tisza and Magyar is just going to basically move into the system of Orban, or as we tend to say in Hungary, is he going to just live in the system of what Orban established, as probably one of the most fundamental questions currently in Hungary. And I think that concerns queer rights and LGBTQ plus rights as well, and communities. And I think, and maybe in the later stage, we're going to talk a little bit about the new um, constitutional process in Hungary that's going to start in a couple of months. And TISA really wants to have it as broad as possible, and basically, yeah, involve the entire nation. And I think, and that's why I'm a little bit optimistic in a sense that I think that gives us a chance to start redefining what our institutions mean to us, what civil society means to Hungary, what is the role of NGOs, what are the basic human rights that we should have and should define us as a nation. And I think it goes back to have this excellent historical account of and relations that we can also start redefining maybe that who we want to be. And so I'm really optimistic from that perspective. And maybe when I was preparing, so maybe I can quote someone that I talked to a couple of days ago for another project, but in general about the contemporary Hungarian politics. And he told me that in such a long time, I feel that I can allow myself to be a little bit optimistic. Because speaking of Hungary, so on one hand, I don't think I'm afraid that TISA is going to be the biggest champion and of queer rights or LGBTQ plus communities. But even the fact, and maybe it's I think it's still a big thing that to these communities in Hungary, the fact that the disappearance of the governmental rhetoric, of the institutionalized rhetoric of anti-LGBTQ narrative and propaganda is basically gone, or at least not as prevalent. It definitely means something. And then from the perspective of the focus that yeah, now we can finally, or these communities can start focusing on real question as opposed to coming up with this counter strategy. So I think that means a lot. And just to connect to that, maybe we're gonna talk about this a little bit later. But I also optimistic in a sense that Peter Magyar and Tisa may actually surprise us regarding their stance towards LGBTQ plus communities and queer rights as well, in a positive way. But I think it really goes back to what Catherine and Hadley mentioned, that I think it's now time to start redefining these relations, that also the very facts or the very characteristics that helped Orban to utilize an anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric over the last years. And yeah, they are rooted in history, they are rooted in institutions. And why I'm optimistic, it so far it seems like that I'm leaning towards the sentiment that TISA doesn't simply want to live in this space that Orban created, or this system that Orban created, but wants to at least redefine many aspects of institutions in Hungary and relations in Hungary. And there's a lot to do, but I think we need to acknowledge that there is at least more free space currently for these communities. But of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't so many things to do, so many concerns that are rooted in, yeah, again, history and institutions. But this is something that I think should be acknowledged, and we can maybe a little bit happy about it. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope it was not longer than
Of course, similar to Hadley before, you clocked in at 4 minutes and 30 seconds, so almost on the dot, just 30 seconds apart. But yes, thank you for those great and insightful thoughts there. And also, I think that idea of like cautious optimism I think, is a major theme here of this idea that, Viktor Orban steps down, this person that's been in charge for 16 years, that has done some very horrible things to LGBTQ plus communities in Hungary, as well as giving ideas for other countries around the world. But at the same time, too, there's still questions here on whether or not this actually is a major turning point. Which I think we'll get into some questions a little bit later as well. And in particular, kind of the plans and strategies of Peter Magyar in particular. That said, though, I do want to give everyone their time before I start jumping into too many thoughts and questions. So I will go ahead and pass this off to Anna next and go from there.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. The floor is mine. Great. I would just say that so much has already been said, but I will try to draw upon some of points you have already made, and I will try to add a little bit more of my perspective. And by my perspective, I mean maybe a little bit more of international and IR perspective. So yeah, well, so definitely Orban's removal from office is a political rupture, but interestingly enough, you say Viktor Orban. I think it's so much more to be discussed. It's not just he as a political figure, but it's also, but it does not necessarily mean that what we are speaking about is the end of what we might call Urbanism, right? And his legacy. Specifically in terms of this anti-LGBTQ plus politics, which became a sort of a hallmark of his politics, specifically in Eastern Europe. So I think under Fidesz, I think Hungary became a kind of Europe's clearest example of how anti-minority sexual and gender politics could be folded into this illiberal project, into this illiberal state building project in a sense, right? I know Hadley already mentioned and picked up the issue of sexuality, but I would add a little bit more to it, and I would say that this was never only about sexuality. It was tied to sovereignty, which Catherine was also mentioning, Christianity, or this religious attachment, demographic anxiety in a sense, anti-European Union rhetoric, and of course, more recently the language of child protection, as we know, based on this horrible 2021 child protection law, right, which was later found incompatible with EU law and values, of course. I would say that Orban's defeat matters in three, or at least three. I will try to organize myself in three distinct ways. First, and probably And importantly, it reopens the domestic opportunity structures in the country, sort of into a more permissive environment for public gatherings, public assembly, and a public, discussions about LGBTQ plus rights, and that's absolutely a wonderful step towards something better and a better future. But it also means something more for Europe or for international relations in general, because it weakens a kind of, if I can call it the prestige of this illiberal populist model, right? That Orban was so, eager to promote. Specifically, he offered a kind of a template combining this electoral legitimacy, media capture, right, constitutional engineering, as you, Robert, mentioned in the introduction, and of course anti-gender mobilization. And lastly, and probably, the most importantly from my perspective, it creates this effect when we come to this conclusion, when we understand that illiberal regimes are durable. They are, whether we like it or not, but they are also not invulnerable. And I think this is something important when we think about these, structures of opportunity here for civil society movements. I will just say, maybe on a more pessimist note than Martin started his talk, which I will say that leadership change is not a social transformation, right? Or at least not yet. Might be the beginning, not necessarily might end as a social transformation. And I think anti-queer, politics survives through not only Orban as a political figure, but also his legacy, by which I mean churches, parties, local governments, courts, media, and everyday practices, including the practices of stigma. And I think he left, to some extent, he left politics, he left the government, right? But the whole, the coalitions that's made anti-queer mobilization effective, in fact, have not, right? And this is quite a challenge. So I think what matters now, and sort of a question I would like to kind of throw at you, but also just to end my opening statement here, would be that removing this right-wing populists may open space, may democratize the space, but it does not really guarantee any consolidation of rights. And specifically for queer communities, the real question is whether this democratic opening and this opportunity that is coming can be really turned into durable legal reforms and institutional protection, which was already mentioned by Catherine, that we do need to speak not only about the opportunities, but also how to translate them into these institutional changes that will protect all of us later. I stop here.
All right, fantastic. And thank you also. We have an optimistic appraisal, a little bit more of a pessimistic. So always good to have the full range. And I think you bring up a phenomenal question there of just because you remove a right-wing populist does not mean that we're guaranteeing rights. So we need to ask questions also about civil society. What do you do when you have these opportunities as well? I think those are some fantastic points there. Also, just to add there too, bringing this into a bigger question, not just about sexuality, but talking about sovereignty, Christianity, anti-EU sentiments. I think all of these kind of, conflate together. So I really appreciate that analysis there to really get us going. And that question being one of the ones I have here on my sheet as well. So I'm certain we'll get into that. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pass this off to the last of our panelists before we get into some questions, answers, and comments. So, Michael, I will cede the floor to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tanner. And really interesting to hear everyone's perspective so far. I think there's been a lot of interesting points here that I agree with, that I think will be a great basis for discussion. And what I'll share actually is, or what I'm planning to share is, we'll touch on a lot of, I think, similar themes, but with a bit of a different sort of theoretical lens. So I think that I hope kind of might be interesting for the discussion. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, kind of what Orban's ouster means for the broader LGBTQ plus rights movement in the region. I think, on one hand, I think sort of a cautious optimism, as you said, Tanner, and others have suggested, maybe is a good way to characterize how I feel about it. I think that, on one hand, it's certainly a source of inspiration and hope, right? And I think where I draw that from in particular is the idea that these broader coalitions concerned with democracy, with corruption, rule of law, can actually unseat these really deeply entrenched authoritarian leaders. And I think that's really a source of hope and inspiration for not just queer communities, but I think people who are concerned about democracy in general. And I think, there's certainly, it's likely, right, there's hope that there will be, policy and legal reforms at, the structural level that in Hungary that will be favorable to the queer community. And I think that's very important. But I think, another thing that has sort of been suggested by others as well, is that there's, beyond the structural level, there's sort of a social psychological infrastructure, as I describe it, against or countering LGBTQ plus rights, that still exists, right? So Orban has sort of helped create this, along with a lot of other kind of moral conservative actors in Eastern Europe and the region. And that machinery really very much still, I think, will still continue to exist and is being advanced by other actors in the region. This sort of and that infrastructure is most visibly present, and these public narratives we hear right about portraying the LGBTQ plus rights movement as a foreign threat to the nation, to local values and norms. And basically, a part of these broader narratives that are sort of trying to draw a boundary between Eastern Europe and Western Europe against sort of European cosmopolitanism, using things like child protection and family protection narratives as a basis for constructing threats, basically, and as sort of a strategy of regime maintenance, right, based on kind of fear and constructing perceived threats. And that those narratives exist all around the region and globally today, and I think those will still continue beyond Orban. And I think that this Hadley, you made the point that basically we kind of see these movements up and down, maybe in terms of the movement, moments of hope, and also some backsliding. And I think that this, again, social psychological infrastructure is important to keep in mind for those, and it helps explain kind of those ups and downs, right? Because that's still there, right? And the reason why we see, we might see moments of hope and progress, but also backsliding is because other leaders are still going to be able to tap into those threats and fears in society that have been shaped by not just Orban, but many other actors in the region. And I think another thing I want to mention is that there are other models of governance, I think, beyond the one that Orban has championed in the region that are also problematic for LGBTQ plus rights. And as someone who specializes in Serbia, I'll talk a bit about that context because the Vučić and the government there has taken quite a different approach, but that is also harmful for the community there. Really, they don't have a leader in Serbia that is openly anti-LGBTQ plus in the way that Orban has been. They've operated more according to an approach of sort of strategic ambiguity, right? So they basically, as a candidate for EU accession, they've made sort of tactical concessions in some ways, things like allowing LGBTQ plus pride events to happen every year, providing protection for them, and making other sort of tactical policy level concessions to basically appease EU leadership, while also really not allowing for more deeper and meaningful change on some of the issues that are most important to the community, to appease both, I think, what is a quite socially conservative population, but also some other, I think, leaders in the region who they want to who Vučić wants to maintain positive relationships with. And so I think and that in Serbia, because of that model, I would best describe the situation as sort of stagnant in Serbia. There's been a really active civil society there for a very long time, for decades, working on LGBTQ plus rights, very high capacity, very strong, very highly visible in society. But there really hasn't been much change over the past several years on some of the policy and legal changes that the community has been championing. Things like same-sex marriage rights, child adoption rights, equal gender identity recognition. There really has been much change, and so I think that's been really difficult for the community there. Yeah, and I think again, kind of as a final point, going back to sort of the social psychological underpinnings of LGBT rights opposition there, the narrative that again has been used by moral conservatives across the world, really, not just in the region, to counter LGBT rights. It also becomes very localized, right? Like in Serbia, for example, it's very much tied in with the country's sort of broader narratives there that portraying the West as a threat that's seeking to sort of destabilize the country. When you analyze these narratives, as I have done in my research, you see that they tie to things like the NATO bombings by the U.S. in 1999, the status of Kosovo. All of these different issues are packaged together to basically portray a world where the West is just trying to undermine the country, the nation, destabilize it, and threaten their cultural values and identity. And so I think that's again something that is very much tied, has been adapted for different countries and the purposes of the movements there, and really will remain there, regardless of whether Orban is there. So those are my initial thoughts.
Fantastic, Michael. So again, thank you for that. And I think you also bring in a lot of great stuff there in terms of conversations around not just in Hungary, but also in Serbia as well. Your conversation about strategic ambiguity is going to be a major element, I think, that factors into a lot of countries and how they respond to not just the EU, but other Eastern European countries, to Russia, to kind of being caught in the middle of a variety of different great power politics as well, to bring that IR element into conversation. But also bringing up that conversation also about like human rights co-option that you see from these right-wing populist establishments using like human trafficking and child protection as a means of trying to, quiet down conversation around LGBTQ plus rights or using it against LGBTQ plus rights. So I think those are some fantastic points to really bring in and to have that conversation, as well as just the idea of like the machine. While Orban might be gone, the person that maybe made the machine keeps churning and keeps going. But with that, so thank you all for your opening comments. I think that we really have started to kind of push forward here. So at this point, we're going to open up with the questions comment section where we're going to expand outwards. We're going to get some questions from the audience. For those in attendance, just to let you know, we have both the raise hand feature as well as the chat function. So if you have a question that you'd like to share, you can either raise your hand or you can put it into the chats. Myself and also our ISA Tech Joel will be monitoring them, so we'll be able to get to you. I'm going to start off with the first question as being chair and discussion, because I think one of the major elements here, I think, was brought up by most of the people in the room is the questions of this critical juncture. As scholars were trained to see critical junctures in history, and in particular, Viktor Orban probably does qualify for this, but it's a question of in what way does this impact things moving forward, not just domestically, but internationally as well. And I think it was also brought up as well. It's important to also discuss that, Orban may have left, but Orban and Orbanism continues to move forward. And even in Hungary, Peter Magyar is not exactly the most progressive leader that the world has ever seen. He is self-described as a conservative liberal and a critical pro-European. Not just that, he was a former member of Fidesz and has a lot of Orban's more right-wing kind of ideologies. So it's important to really have a conversation here, which is this a critical juncture for Hungary and for Eastern European countries and LGBTQ plus communities? What is this actually going to impact here? Are we going to see a little bit more of this, what we talked about, cautious optimism, or is this going to continue? The machine keeps moving forward, and even with Orban in the rearview mirror, these things still keep pushing forward. So I will open up to the floor, whoever would like to go first.
Thank you. Somebody has to go first. I think it's a great question. It's a fundamental question, particularly given what as we've all said, I think, about the way that Orban has been sort of turned into this model or template or spiritual guide for so many other places and politicians and movements, throughout the world. And I think it gets back to these issues of trust, optimism, and pessimism that we've seen, and maybe to this question of the ups and downs of history, or the ins and out of history. I think it's really important. Um, it's really important to realize that somebody like Orban, even though he seemed very firmly embedded in power, even though he had built this system, which was heavily biased towards him personally and Fidesz as a party, and its affiliate parties as well, and had manipulated the electoral system, and had created this enormous propaganda structure, control of the media, etc. Nonetheless, it is very important for people to realize that he can still be kicked out, be replaced, and I think that's heartening for a lot of us. I think it's very easy to think, that these trajectories, whether sort of more progressive or less progressive, more conservative, are more lasting than they are. And I think it's really easy to build these fears we have of that kind of persistence into narratives of hopelessness. This is something, I mean, I think starting with Martin, that we were talking about in terms of the question of trust, and it's well known in a scholarly and kind of popularly proverbial fashion that Eastern Europe is this realm of political cynicism, right? And now, of course, everywhere is a realm of political cynicism and lack of trust. But I think that this sort of thing can really lead us to think, okay, maybe we're not stuck, maybe we're not trapped, maybe this is not inevitable and endless, maybe we have a voice that matters, and maybe we can change things. That in a gender studies department and through a feminist theoretical lens, we might say we have some kind of agency here. And I think that's very important, particularly if we're trying to imagine how trust works to build better systems. We have to have some sense of our own power. And I think this is helpful. And that's a template that we need everywhere.
Some fantastic points, Hadley, most certainly. Anyone else like to add some more to that?
Yeah, just very quickly. And I think it's also related to the excellent comment by Anna about system change. I think what also matters here, and that's probably if you start comparing the cases, that's probably different from the Polish case, after the loss of law and justice a couple of years ago. That here it seems like also the institutions that helped to fuel the anti-LGBTQ narrative over the last years are just disappearing very quickly. So when I talk about these institutions, so I mean the state media, right? So how quickly the state media, it seems like, turning into something, well, consumable, right? Or the propaganda machine. And probably for that, it definitely helps that Peter Magyar has a two-third majority and this has two-third majority. But I think that can actually, in the long run, may contribute to the system change, that all these institutions that Orban occupied over the last 16 years seems like disappearing, or at least getting back their meanings. And of course, I'm maybe too optimistic here, and then this is going to be a stress over the next couple of months and years, whether that's indeed be the case. But I think that gives probably more hope to just people of believers of liberal democracy, but also to civil society and queer communities, that all these institutions that help the Orban rhetoric, Orban narrative, seems like they are disappearing or just changing.
Fantastic, Martin. 100%. Great conversation points here. I do have two questions. And one in the chat, one elsewhere. So I'll just ask, does anyone else want to give their 2 cents on this question before I go to the questions that we have kind of lined up in the queue?
Yeah, maybe just a quick note just to finish, because
Sure.
we have sorry, yeah, can I? Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
please, by all means.
because we've been covering domestic politics as we should be. It matters for everyone, for citizens of all sorts. But I would just say the defeat, Orban's defeat also matters from European perspective, but also internationally. So maybe once again, I would just add this international level of analysis here by saying that this is quite important because the EU, the European Union, and the legal system, but also the Court of Justice of the European Union plays a key role. This is the key to here, protecting human rights within the European Union, right? Which matters not only in the case of Hungary, but also, as we know, in the May 2026 case, regarding a Polish citizen, right? Which I probably will, elaborate later. So speaking about this legal framework and this external audience framework and audience, watching what happens here in Eastern Europe, I will also say that it matters because we have a clear and a very neat example that this anti-EU, anti-gender populism will end at some point. It's not, we understand that it is politically, bound to end at some point. But I will just say that it's also, and I think Catherine already mentioned this, institutionalization of anti-gender politics. So now we have to de-institutionalize this anti-gender politics and think how to accommodate all of the rights for all of the citizens we are speaking about. And I think there is a template of behavior, practices, and also including discourse of how we say, how we speak about human rights in general, based on those unfortunate experiences of non-democratic regimes and non-democratic experiences. And I'm saying this here because these external watchers, whether we speak about the previous Polish government, or maybe we are speaking about Kremlin these days, they learn, right? So this lesson that the illiberal project can end at any point is this, it fuels a little bit of optimism here. So I would not neglect this international, European and international, leverage we can use when we speak about human rights in general, but also, of course, LGBTQ plus rights in particular. Yeah, thanks.
100%. So no, Anna, appreciate most certainly that international element to add there. Because we have some great conversation about domestically, locally, but this is a bigger international issue. So really appreciate bringing that conversation in as well as that domestic perspective. Michael, your hand is up.
Yeah, just to add something quickly on this before we move to the next question. I mean, I think I can't speak a lot to the context of Hungary because it's not one that I really specialize in, but I can maybe speak to an issue that speak to this a little bit from a broader regional perspective. I mean, I think that again, Orban being out as sort of a leader of the anti-LGBTQ plus rights movement is again certainly significant, but I think there are other very influential ones in the region who still are in power, and in a lot of ways, for some other countries in the region, I see Putin as more of a sort of symbolic leader of that movement. Who he was, I think, more sort of first to more really champion this sort of traditional values language as a basis for countering the movement. And I think that his influence is particularly powerful in countries that share this sort of pan-Slavic, in particular Orthodox Christian identity. And Serbia is one of those places. And so I think, that source of leadership is still very much, an inspiration for those movements. And obviously he's in the region and Serbia in particular, and he's very much still in power. And so I think that that's, something important to consider, is that, Orban was not the only very highly visible kind of leader internationally against this movement in the region.
I think there's some great points there also, bringing in that regional element as well, and the fact that Orban is not alone in these conversations, in this position. With that said, great points all around. We do have two questions right now in the chat and the Q&A. Really quickly, first is from Philip Ayub. Joel, could you potentially give Philip Ayub the space? Because the question and information you put in here is kind of chopped up into three separate sections, so it's a little hard to read. That is obviously, Philip, if you're comfortable having the chat on, via actual voice message.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for great interventions. I just wanted to reflect briefly on kind of the agency of queer people or LGBT people in the outcome itself. And so kind of flip the causal arrow. And I think at the end, a comment from Hadley reflected on that. But I ask it partly because Sam Witt and I have been doing surveys in Hungary since the Pride ban last year, and then before and after Pride, and then also before and after the election. And we are finding that this seemed to matter quite a bit for flipping evaluations of Viktor Orban, and that folks really felt like it had gone a step too far. And there was kind of what we call a threat inversion mechanism, that seeing the Pride with so many people that were ordinary having a joyful celebration really defanged some of this idea that LGBT people themselves were a threat, and helped reflect that these attacks on LGBT people might have a broader attack on democracy. So I guess my question was just, how do you see the role of this momentous event that happened last summer, about a year ago, exactly, and also the role of queer people in kind of teaching us how to topple liberalism in the first place, which I think is really important lesson here as well, since as many participants so rightly said, this is a playbook that's being repeated in many places by authoritarian liberal leaders. And I think queer people teach us a lot about fighting back there. Thank you so much for letting me have the mic.
First off, Bill, it's good to talk to you again. And also, thank you so much for your insightful comments. I will turn this over to the floor. Would anyone like to tackle this question head on? Hadley, please. Yes, by all means.
Not trying to, create a pattern here. Yeah, thanks, Philip. Last, we've never met, I believe, but I certainly know your work and appreciate it very much. I think it's a really important point. I think that this Pride March, the 2025 March, was a very important one. And I think one of the ways in which it was most important is that it made it clear that there were a lot of people who, regardless of how they may have felt about LGBTQ plus queer people, felt that their rights, the rights of queer people, had somehow become representative of the rights of a great number of people. So one of the things that the Orban government was doing, or a couple of the things that they were doing against a queer march, were actually very, very evidently directed at everybody's rights. So the use of facial recognition technology by the police, right? The attempt to ban the free right of assembly by citizens. And this made it very clear that there were more fundamental issues which happened to be appearing specifically with regards to queer people and a queer march. And I think this made a huge difference and made people realize, well, this is a sort of a line that's been crossed. It's not just a sexual minority that is being affected. It's me as well. And it made connections in people's minds over the question of rights and governance that perhaps hadn't been made before by everyone. So I think that's really important. The other thing I would say is, yes, the idea that sort of targeted and oppressed activists can resist and do so somewhat successfully. I mean, the idea, I think this is very much connected to what I was trying to say about our sense of agency and how activism can create this or strengthen this. The sense that people can actually go out in a situation like that and express themselves, and that it matters. I mean, the people I spoke to about the 2025 March pretty much all said, wow, it just felt like an entirely different atmosphere that day. And that there was kind of a fundamental transformation in the sense of like the normality of space, not necessarily in a sexual way, but in a political way. And I think that's really important. And it's important to remember that activists under Orban, even in this very targeted, oppressed situation, were proposing alternatives to these narratives of anti-West, anti-national, anti-queer um, hetero-reproductive narratives against queer people and others, this idea of these national myths. Um, and I think that probably many of you have heard of this book of fairy tales that was released a few years ago, uh, sort of reworking national mythic Hungarian tales to include disabled animals, people, non-sexually normative relationships, non-gender normative relationships. And I think this is just one example of the kind of alternative visions of an inclusive society, right? That was accepting of, could be accepting of diversity, that really helped people think, okay, we can keep some of our Hungarianness. We don't have to become just like, non-Hungarians. We don't have to lose that, but we can also be accepting of others. And I think this kind of agentive creation of an alternative series of identity myths is incredibly important and powerful. So I think this, like the march, really these are things that fed into this sense of other possibilities and resistance. So I'll stop there.
I think those are some fantastic points, Hadley, and I think I will just also add to those points as well, and just at least my thought on Philip's discussion of the Pride March is just once again the very beautiful like resilience of civil society. I think it really very much speaks to the idea that as much as resistance and repression occurs, they find new and creative ways to really make impacts and make very large, substantial changes to these political structures, even whenever repression is extremely high. So they think there's fantastic comments there. I do have another question here in the comments from Alexis Roti. Apologies for the mispronunciation of your last name, but I'll go ahead and read this here and then we'll go from there. We have seen Magyar's work up the parliament to push through bills, media, freedom, anti-corruption, term limits. I saw a commitment to repeal the aforementioned 2021 law. How's that going? And for a new constitution, do we know how all the culture wars currently embedded in the constitution, parentheses, two sexes, marriage between a man and a woman, father is a man and mother is a woman, would survive following this inclusive process? And do you know of any other countries where the Constitution has been so involved in this culture war?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer to the very last question. There are experts on this panel compared to me. But regarding the first one, so I think it's gonna be so what currently Magyar and TISA promise is that it's gonna involve in some way the entire nation, and it's gonna the new constitutional process, and it's gonna conclude with the referendum. This is just much more meaningful compared to the last one when Orban and Fidesz rewrote the constitution. I think it was in 2011, which was basically a work of one of the members of Fidesz, who was back then European Parliament member, and it's a well-known trope in Hungary that yeah, he basically wrote it on a plane going back, and he proudly said that. So I think it's just gonna be much more meaningful and more democratic in a sense, that involving in some ways the entire nation. And I think it's gonna take quite some time. I'm not so sure about how that would involve all these culture wars. What is certain, for example, I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago when Amnesty International Hungary just put out a proposal addressing the Hungarian government that, yeah, in some way there should be an acknowledgement of, or there should be, or the same-sex couples marriage should be part of Hungarian law. Also, a couple of weeks ago, there was a poll by Median, which is the most reliable pollster in Hungary, and that basically showed that two-thirds of Hungarians support the marriage of same-sex couples. So I think these kind of signs may may show us there's some discussions regarding the constitutions about that. But just to conclude it, or just to summarize it, that I think it's gonna be a, rightly so, a long-lasting process, and apparently it's gonna start sometime in the fall. Yeah, that's what I can say, at least regarding the first part of the question.
Fantastic. Anna, please.
Yeah, maybe over to Catherine, and then I will take the floor after
Oh,
her.
excuse me,
If it's
Catherine.
all right. Yeah, she was first.
Thanks, Anna.
My apologies,
Oh, no,
Catherine, please.
not at all. I'll be brief. It's to address the second part of the question, and moving over to the South Caucasus a bit. The Republic of Georgia is another example where legislation has been passed and it's embedded in the Constitution, right? That marriage is between a man and a woman, and it's for the purposes of family creation. And so that's also the anti-LGBTQ plus law, right? It's been dubbed that, but it's really under the guise of protecting the family and protecting traditional values. And that's coming off the heels, right, of about a decade of the Orthodox Church. They're declaring, family values and Purity Day, right, on May 17th. And the Georgian Dream government just recently made that a national holiday, right? So it's legislation is in place. I'm sure there are other examples as well, but if you're curious about more governments, right, that put those into the Constitution, those kinds of anti-LGBTQ plus rights laws there, Georgia is an example of that. And over to Anna. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I would just add, because I haven't had a chance to reflect on Poland, maybe this is the time I actually do this. So, of course, Poland is also this very case of having a discussion. First, experiences this cultural war, what is a marriage, and who should be allowed to become a parent, or at least in legal terms, right? It's been years of this discussion we have had so far. I would just say that Polish case might be a little bit more optimistic than the Hungarian one, and I will say why. I think we might be. Well, we did talk about cautious optimism. I would say, well, let's talk about cautious improvement, and maybe this is where I can speak about Polish case quite as well. So, of course, we cannot really talk about consolidated protection in Poland. Unfortunately, we cannot, right? But there is some sign of an improvement. I think there has been a great progress, maybe more symbolic progress than institutional one or legal one, but at least symbolic progress is a progress of some sort. So that's a good sign. I would just say progress since Law and Justice. And I will say that Law and Justice ruled the country between 2015, 2023. And for those who may not necessarily heard about this party, this is the right-wing party that governed, as I said, for 8 years, and used anti-minority rhetoric as a part of this nationalist, Catholic, conservative kind of anti-liberal project quite as well. So now, for the last almost 3 years, we have moved, or the Tusk government has moved from this very hostile rhetoric. I think two changes are important to be mentioned and to be discussed. That would be the abolition of the something very unfortunate. This was called LGBT-free zones, right? Introduced during the, sorry, I had to I had to bring this up. Right. So the abolition is a good sign. It's a step forward. And I think it was symbolically, but also politically relevant that they were abolished. Right. Because I think it also speaks to a few comments and thoughts you have already raised, but also to Philip's comment and also his research. I think this LGBT-free zones were particularly disturbing because they created because these were local resolutions for which, cities and counties declared opposition to so-called LGBTQ plus ideology. And I think it's quite important to mention that we are speaking about people, but somehow we have this dehumanized rhetoric of ideology, right? But in fact, we are speaking about people, right? So this is also an important part of this discourse. And also, I think they created this exclusionary public environment, right? And marked this minority or minority citizens as outsiders to local moral communities, right? And we have to actually address this very rhetoric, this very discourse, public discourse that became, in a sense, routinized and normalized in our public debate. And that's a real issue. I will say, because this is maybe a little bit more touching upon, narratives and discourse, but we do have an important step forward in terms of recognition of equal marriage. That would be this May 2026 case you may have heard of. Right. And I'm saying this as it's more of administrative recognition of same-sex marriages. So I would just say that Poland in a sense, was forced to accept same-sex marriage of a Polish citizen based on the Court of Justice of the European Union ruling that the marriage is valid in any European country, right? If it was taken within the EU boundaries, which was the case. And of course, the current president, Karol Nawrocki, he objected, but the ruling stands as is, right? Again, this is not a legal change. It doesn't really, increases the protection mechanism within the country here in Poland, but it definitely speaks, something important about at least our societal and political change and attitudes towards marriage equality. But then I will just say that at the same time, the main weakness, again, still is that this legal reforms of any kind, of two kinds, they remain incomplete. So we still lack this domestic marriage legal framework, civil, but also, regulations on civil partnerships for parental recognition, etc. Right? But at least it opens space, it opens the door to have a broader and maybe more liberal discussion and more inclusive discussion of what must be done in the future to actually secure LGBTQ rights. Yeah, I stop here.
So, so Anna, I will say really quickly, I say that hand, Michael, by the way, that I do appreciate you bringing up those abolition, those LGBTQ plus free zones. That was a question I had down here for you. So you just answered my entire question while answering Alexis's question. So much appreciated. And very insightful comments. I'm going to go over to Michael, and then I have two other questions. And again, for anybody in attendance, if you have any questions you would like to ask, please feel free to put them in the chats, and I would love to read them off. But Michael, please.
I'll successfully unmute myself this time. Thanks, Dinner.
Yes.
I wanted to sort of respond to Phil's question earlier a little bit more directly, but also the comments I think are relevant to a lot of the things that we've been discussing. I really appreciate the emphasis on what we can learn from the community. I was the LGBTQ community in particular in these contexts, and that kind of came to my mind as well. In response to the first question about, whether this can be a source of hope, I kind of was wishing we had some activists on the call who could speak, more directly to that. But obviously all of us are focused on these issues as well. But I think that I really appreciate the connection that you made to the broader kind of movement for democracy and maybe ways that the communities are adapting some of their strategies in line a bit, and to sort of do that depending on how the context has shifted. And I want to I'm thinking about the context in Serbia again, like drawing from my own research, where you've seen the movement, the queer movement there actually shift tactically their frames around kind of some broader democracy movements that have been happening in that country. I'm not sure if how familiar you all are with that context, but basically a couple of years ago there was a really public tragedy where a railway station collapsed in Novi Sad and killed several people, and this sparked these nationwide protests that sort of concerned with democracy, corruption, rule of law, that are continuing to this day, and they're very, very active and are largely being driven by students now, and which is very consistent with kind of the past experience of protests in Serbia. And these protests are really concerned with broader democratic freedoms, also things like the protection of civil society, rule of law in the country. There's also a strong theme of police violence, because there have been violent crackdowns against a lot of the student protesters. And what's been really interesting to watch, in terms of queer activism is that, I think that they've kind of shifted their frame to align themselves with this broader movement that's really powerful and going on in the country. And so the dominant frames in Serbia in the past for LGBT rights have been sort of human rights frames and pro-EU frames, European Union frames. But what we've seen them do now is actually shift to sort of rhetorically align themselves with these concerns about democratic freedoms and protection of civil society, and basically saying, hey, and in particular police violence, right? Because this is an issue that has faced queer people in the past, and I think the broader message is that, hey, if this is what happens when a government is allowed to repress any group that opposes it in some ways. And so I think it's been really interesting to watch that reframing happen. And I've been curious to know if maybe that framing could shift the way that people are respond to that community in Serbia. For my own dissertation research, I ran surveys around Europride in 2022 to see how that event shifted social norm perceptions and personal attitudes, and also behavioral intentions around support for gay and lesbian rights. And my research basically found that there wasn't any meaningful change. But I think it sort of depends on the context and the framing of the event, right? Because in Serbia, for Europride, it was really chaotic, right? There was this event had been planned for years, but in the couple of weeks before the event, in line with this sort of strategic ambiguity approach, the government suddenly started threatening to cancel it because they were concerned about negative responses to holding this very prominent European event in Serbia. They were tying it to security issues in Kosovo. There was all this uncertainty and pushback from the LGBT activists and the European community in response to this. And eventually, the event was allowed to happen at the very last minute, and they provided police protection, but it was very heavily securitized and repressed. There was supposed to be this whole path through the entire city that it followed the march in particular, not the whole week of events. But there was it ended up happening basically on one sort of short city block within the city. And so, and I think, in Serbia, when I think about the context of when I try to explain why there was no significant effect on people's attitudes, I explain it by basically saying in part that it was the framing around the event and all the chaos that occurred. There wasn't like a clear normative signal. But also that's a country where my data suggests that people didn't meaningfully differentiate the European event from the typical pride parades that have been happening for years. And people basically, Serbia's been having pride parades for a long time, and they just thought it was another of the same. And there really wasn't a lot that happened. And people just at this point, they're like, this is just an elite event that people hold that doesn't really have any meaning for our societal norms. And but again, I find really interesting the research that you mentioned, Philip, where you said that basically these public demonstrations maybe help defang these threats, because I think maybe again in Serbia's case the event was allowed to eventually happen, so there wasn't a clear kind of repression of the group necessarily in many people's eyes, unfortunately. But maybe in these cases where people start to connect, where the event is banned and it's very clearly being repressed, maybe people are better able to connect it with these broader concerns about kind of democratic freedoms, and maybe that plays a role as a mechanism here in trying to help again, like that, I think conduct this sort of threat inversion that you mentioned. So super interesting.
Fantastic comments there, Michael, most certainly. We are starting to approach the end point of this, so I have two other questions I would like to get to. So I'm going to keep moving us forward here. So the first one is actually directed specifically to you, Catherine, because everyone's had a chance to kind of talk about some of their areas of interest. I think you brought up Georgia a little bit, but I was kind of curious also, we've seen some right-wing populist groups lose ground over time, but Georgia is kind of heading in the opposite direction, becoming more pro-Russian and also more repressive to their LGBTQ plus community. So I was curious, What does something like Orban being voted out have? Like, does it energize? Does it speak to a larger movement? Is it going to do anything for Georgian LGBTQ plus politics or queer community to see somebody like Orban removed from power?
Well, thanks, Tanner. I think in a symbolic sense,
Mhm.
perhaps, but on the ground, I would say it's looking pretty dire, not very optimistic at all.
Mhm.
And I say that for a few reasons. So to kind of, and I'll be aware of time when I give
Oh
this
yeah.
answer.
Come on.
When we talk about Georgia, Georgia's never been a consolidated democracy, right? It's slowly been eking its way on an EU path, but has paused, right? And that comes after the series of right anti-LGBTQ legislation, but also foreign agents law. Right. So it comes on the heels of very starkly illiberal turns. Um, Whether that's necessarily pro-Russian, it does get characterized like that a lot. I think in Georgia's case in particular, the Orthodox Church and the societal trust and respect of the Orthodox Church outweighs any respect for politicians in Georgia. So the church for a long time had publicly been opposed to LGBTQ plus rights, right? As far back vocally as 2014, but even before then. There's a segment, right, of the clergy that opposes the church's official position, right, against. But these clergy are usually ostracized. So it is more of a pervasive sentiment, right, in society that Georgian Dream has capitalized on and linked itself with the Orthodox Church to help
Mhm.
shore up its power. Um, Now, I would say, kind of to really just directly address, in Georgia, civil society organizations such as Tbilisi Pride, right, they've really gone underground. So since the anti-LGBTQ law was passed, there has really, it's not to say it's non-existent at all, but its activities really have ceased to exist. And Pride festivals, any kind of Pride visibility has been attacked multiple times over the years, even before the anti-LGBTQ legislation. So it's never really been a positive picture for these rights in Georgia and has only gotten worse. And Georgian Dream has been able, as of now, to really shore up and kind of consolidate. I think Anna was talking earlier about the longevity of illiberal regimes, right? And I think that's certainly the case, what we're seeing with Georgia right now. That's what I would say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Most certainly to give that insightful, even somewhat, pessimistic to our cautious optimism, pessimistic conversation, but still to give us some very insightful information on the Georgian case in particular and how this relates to this larger conversation. I do have one more question here. We might go a little bit over time, but not the end of the world before we kind of close it out here. But I think one of the things that we really need to address directly which we already kind of addressed a little bit with Philip's question, is in particular queer communities and queer civil society. How do they respond to something like Orban being ousted? We talked a lot about Budapest Pride and the ways in which it was a revolutionary movement, and I also mentioned briefly of the ways in which civil society is very resilient and very creative with how they can take on repressive regimes. So, how does civil society queer communities react to this? How does activism shape and change from this situation? Do we see more of what Lynette Chua calls like pragmatic resistance, where it's very kind of downplayed resistance, or do you see more brazen activity such as Budapest 2025? So I think that's kind of the question here I'd like to ask is, how do queer communities, how does queer civil society respond to something like Orban being ousted and these right-wing populist movements as they're currently standing?
Well, we'll see on Saturday, I guess.
I guess
Because
so.
Budapest Pride is Saturday, right? So
Ah,
that's all I want to say.
I'll say, fantastic, Hadley. I will say I was not aware until just recently that Budapest Pride was so close, or I would have tried to push for a little bit past Budapest. But still, you're right. Saturday is going to be a very big moment. Do I have some other thoughts? If not, I can at least add some information here before we move to closing remarks. Once again, really appreciated Philip's comments here about Budapest 2025 and just the ways in which that civil society is a very resilient force. It is one that faces repression a lot in a variety of different ways. And something in my mind, such as Orban being removed from power, is something that can be a victory, but there are still, as we talked about today, a large theme is that cautious optimism and that pessimism as well. That even though we do see progress, such as the elimination of LGBT free zones, or the maybe even if Magyar and Tiza actually tried to remove these constitutional amendments, that you still have this uphill battle to go, especially as a lot of these movements start to shift and change over time. So I think that we're going to see a lot more creative decision making from civil society and how to tackle these places as they close one door to try to find the next door or even burst through a wall, as it were. But that said, we're coming close to the end here. I'm going to say if we could just go around the room and just have some kind of quick closing remarks on how we can kind of finish all of this out before we conclude today. So with that, does anyone want to take their closing remarks first? If not, I'll happily call on people.
I'll go ahead. So I think, from today's discussion and, I've really appreciated it and everything that colleagues have had to say. I think it's important to keep in mind that what has been pointed out here is that it's measured, right? I hear the optimistic, about opening up structures and opportunities for civil society, and that's certainly important, and it's not to be discounted. And then also realizing too that when we are talking about, the East European space or the South Caucasus, that these are very there are variations, right, among states, and it's certainly not a monolith. So how there can be cues from certain governments. I mean, it was said for a long time that Georgian Dream leadership was taking its cues from Orban at times, right? So it's certainly illiberal leaders do speak to each other in a way like that, certainly. But just as we go through over time, it'll be interesting to see how this transpires and how much progress can be made in the context of Hungary, but also just how quickly things can regress, especially without having rights institutionalized and having to undo a lot of the harm that's been done, right, over the years. And particularly, I mean, if we're focusing on Hungary's case here today, particularly over the last 16 years, but even, before, it's not as if the rights situation was completely perfect before Orban came to power. So it's hard to go back to a very optimistic, quote unquote, perfect situation for rights, because in many of these places it has never existed. So I just think it's something to keep in mind.
Fantastic. For the sake of kind of moving forward in a little bit more expedient pace, I'm just going to call on people as we go. So once again, I'm going to go based on my screen here. Anna, you are next.
Yeah, wonderful. I would just, mirroring the previous or the last question, I would just say, that I think the strategic lesson and a kind of a finding is always context specific, right? So if we can speak and try to generalize it somehow and make a concluding remark, I would say that in this post-populist openings, activists can push harder just for repair, recognition, and of course institutional guarantees. And I think, I would never drop this legal institutional security, speaking very broadly, again in a partially liberalized cases, thinking about Poland now, I think activists and civil society can do so much more. They need to combine this litigation, legislative advocacy, lobbying, right? So this is not just going on the streets and being visibly present, right, in public, but also thinking about legal changes, but also including coalition pressures, etc. I will just say maybe, and I will try to go back to my opening, and I will say when the opportunity shows itself, we just have to think how to use it smartly, wisely. And I will say it's not only about going to streets, it's also about visibility, but it's also about thinking and anticipating, right, what comes next, right? And I will just say illiberal regimes are durable, right? In a sense that there will be this conservative backlash in the future for sure. So the question is once again how to secure this legal and institutional protection, in a longer run, before those anti-gender or even, more broadly human rights movement reorganize themselves probably quite soon.
Fantastic. Martin, you are next on my list.
Yeah, so thank you so much for organizing this panel. I really enjoyed it. In closing, I was thinking about that over the last 16 years, Hungary was really this illustrative or extreme case, as the literature likes to call, of building illiberalism. And I think the question is whether we can be an extreme case in the coming years of trying to establishing or trying to put out the building blocks of building something institutional protection for various human rights and queer communities as well, including. And in closing, I would like to partly answer to the previous question just very quickly, because I think, so yeah, we have the Pride on Saturday, and I think the question is, which was really missing over the last 16 years, especially when LGBTQ plus people were targeted by the government, as the corporate support, the support of other organizations. And I know that this should be questioned, and this is maybe a selfish that I'm bringing in here because that's my research is about. But I think the question is who is gonna actually speak up for these communities, for queer people, and here I'm talking about organizations. So to me, it was just utterly shocking how that was lacking over the last 16 years, and they were pretty much laid low and were silent. So I'm curious whether that's gonna be changed, whether there will be these protectors of these communities outside of the civil space or outside of the NGOs that are concerned or that are focusing on that. So that's also a question of the future. Yeah, thank you so much.
You. And some fantastic points there in particular also. Michael, you are next.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. I think this has been a really interesting discussion that we've had, and I think all of us bring sort of different backgrounds and perspectives to the conversation. That's made it really rich. And I kind of see it as sort of a reflection on different legal, political, and social aspects of the ongoing movement for LGBTQ plus rights in the region, and what in particular Orban's transition may or may not mean for that. And maybe just I kind of just want to reiterate again I think the point about how about this kind of social and psychological infrastructure that has been constructed in the region against LGBT rights, and how that's evolved over time. And what I'm really interested in moving forward, both in the context of Hungary and elsewhere, is how the movements can tactically innovate in ways that can help them kind of dismantle that kind of problematic infrastructure, even within sometimes taking advantage of some of these shifts that are happening in the country and leadership in different countries in terms of leadership, things like that. And I'm particularly interested in ways that the messaging that the communities can use, I think, to kind of try to counteract these harmful narratives portraying the movement as non-native and as a foreign threat to the nation. And sort of as we talked about, sort of defang those narratives and kind of reposition the communities as part of the nation. And some of the writing I've done on this and thinking I've done on it has centered around this approach called moral reframing, which I don't know if you all are familiar with, but essentially the idea is to reframe an attitude or behavior to align with people or groups' deeply held values and identities. And so, along those lines, messages that emphasize the community's commitment to sort of the nation, the broader societal well-being, repositioning them as members of the community who are in a way that I think is can be helpful. And I think in some ways can help counteract again this portrayal of the movement as inherently non-native and foreign. And I think there's been some work done on that, but I think that it's really interesting to think about how again the movements can innovate and take advantage of these shifts in context and broader concerns about democratic freedoms and human rights, and the protection of civil society and kind of the well-being of the broader the country under these kind of authoritarian leaders, and whether that could be a productive way for the movements to make social progress, I think, on their inclusion in society. And so those are kind of my closing thoughts. But yeah, thanks again for the great discussion, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future.
Indeed. Fantastic. Hadley, please close us out here before I give some final conclusions.
Okay, thanks. So many things one could say, and I'll just agree with everyone. I think this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you all, and thanks for the audience's questions. I think two main things out of the many things one could say. One gets to this question of, so how does civil society emerge from this juncture of history? And how do queer organizations within it emerge? And I think it's really, really very important to remember that it was coalitions, building on what you said, Anna. It was coalitions and alliances between different groups that made the Budapest Pride March in 2025 such an enormous and powerful force, and that made it possible for Orban and his brigade, as they say in Hungary, to be overthrown. And I think it's very important that these coalitions and alliances and affiliations are maintained. It's very possible in the wake of such a victory to kind of slide back, I think, to a vision of civil society practice, which is much more sort of distinct interest group focused. And that's the way that Hungarian civil society was for many, many years after 89, right? Until, under the pressure of Orban, people were really forced to work together, I think. And I think it's really important not to lose that. And if that's kept together, I think we can develop an entirely new way of thinking about how civil society can and should function. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I would say that one of the things we can learn from this too, for an anthropologist, culture wars and politics, more formal politics, are not distinct, separate things. They're really things that go together because from an anthropological perspective, culture is politics. It's a form of power like any other. And so I think it's really important for communities and organizations and individuals to recognize that this is a battle that continues to need to be fought on both levels at once, together. There may be a different political leadership, a different political party. We may have sort of a reworked political structure, but that's meaningless unless cultural structures, the sort of thing that you're talking about, Michael, are also reformulated. And there's a very close relationship between these two, right? There is, we like to say, mutually constitutive, right? And so I think it's also important in the wake of a victory like this to not just kind of assume that, a battle is won and we can go back to standard assumptions, including a distinction between these things. We have to recognize, as Hungarian activists were recognizing under Orban, that the cultural battle is the political battle and the political battle is a cultural battle. So I guess I'd say that. I hope this is what happens.
I think some fantastic points to kind of really finish out on. I will just parrot that to say that this is a conversation that honestly could last hours. There's so much to unpack here. And most certainly there's questions about what Orban's legacy is going to be. What does the future look like without him? How do civil society respond to this? And also those deeper, as you mentioned, Hadley, those deeper cultural battles that are still always going to be waging, always moving forward. I will go ahead and conclude here to say thank you to my panelists who volunteered to join on for this. I greatly appreciate all of your insightful comments. Thank you for those who listened as well, those in the audience. I don't know how you all go jogging and go and do other things during this. I have to sit at my desk or with my like mug in hand. So, props to you all for that one. And also a special thanks to Joel as well, our ISA tech, who made sure all of this was possible. Thank you all so much for attending and greatly appreciate it. So you all have a lovely rest of your afternoons, mornings, or evenings.